All right. Well, let's. It's 9:02, close enough. Today, actually, I've got a lot of stuff going on today. Because I got to get here, do the announcements. There's this whole teacher thing today. So welcome back. Today is September 14th, a red letter day in history. Today, John Chrysostom died in 407 A.D. John Chrysostom, considered the greatest preacher of the age. That would be the 5th century, right around the time that the Bible, the New Testament as we know it, was coming into focus. He was a contemporary of Augustine, and so he's referred to quite a bit in writings of that era. Speaking of people referred to quite a bit, it was on this date in 1224 that Francis of Assisi had a vision and woke up with the stigmata. This is the story, the stigmata, the wounds of the cross on his hands and his side and his feet. And Francis of Assisi went on to long ministry. Speaking of death, 1321, Dante Alighieri died on this date. Dante, who wrote the Divine Comedy. I just saw a reference to the Divine Comedy yesterday in the paper. Somebody was referring to it, saying that talking about the 9 circles of hell and all that kind of stuff. On this date in 1741, after 24 hours of working on it, Handel finished the Messiah. It's not clear whether he went start to finish the whole thing in 24 hours or on the last day he worked 24 hours straight. I kind of believe it's the latter, but depending on what source you look at, they say, oh no, he wrote the whole thing in 24 hours. I find that really hard to believe.
He was very good.
Yeah, but
he did write it very quickly.
Yeah, whether he did it start to finish in 24 hours, I don't know. But hey, I didn't write it. I don't know. I wasn't there. So it was on this date that Francis Scott Key wrote the poem that later would become the Star Spangled Banner. We kind of forget that if you think about the words of the song. He's standing on a ship. He's watching a battle. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light when the light came up, or the ramparts we watched, or the walls, what so proudly we hailed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that was on this date in 1814. In 1847, the U.S. Marines under General Winfield Scott entered Mexico City. This was part of the Mexican-American War. It's not noticeable, except for the fact that if you know anything about the Marine Corps, and you know their song, the Marine Corps hymn starts off with "From the Halls of Montezuma." That's what they're talking about. This date in 1847. Sacco and Vanzetti trial started on this date in 1920. Does anybody remember those two guys? No, couple of they were convicted of what were they convicted of? Espionage or communist sympathizing agitators, that kind of stuff. It's one of those kind of trials. It was yet another one of those trials of the century kind of thing. There were quite a few of them in all the centuries. There's been, I think in the 20th century, I can think of about 20 trials of the century, but this one was in 1920. Charles H. Gabrid died on this date. Hymn writer, died on this date in 1920. He wrote the hymn "Send the Light," the blessed gospel light, let it shine from shore to shore. Oh, that will be glory for me, glory for me, glory for me. And then one of my favorite, I stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. Also, it was on this date in 1965 that F Troop premiered. If you know, you know, right? Yeah. So yeah, it's F Troop, classic. They don't make shows. They don't make shows like that anymore. So, and finally, it was on this date in 1975 that Elizabeth Ann Bailey Seton was canonized by Pope Paul VI, and this was the first U.S.-born saint. And if I'm not mistaken, he's there. It's not Pope Paul now, but they're working on canonizing the first U.S.-born millennial, somebody who died in his 20s, something like that. But that was the first U.S.-born one on this date in 1975. All right, so we are in 2 Samuel chapter 21. 2 Samuel chapter 21. And I'm titling this Epilogue Part 1. Okay, Epilogue Part 1. And the reason, if you remember when we talked about this last week, right? You were here last week. Kind of lose track of, it's harder for me to break up the days when I'm at church and not anymore. Now it's like, wait, I was just here. Well, no, wait, that was kind of thing. But when we talked last week, we had the second list of David's officials, and I said, looking at the book as a whole, it kind of says this is the end of the story of David, kind of thing. And one of the problems we have when we look at the Bible is we just kind of assume that the book form that it's in is the form that it was always in. That makes sense. Okay, so that we just kind of assume that it was always in this nice typeset and nice, and that Samuel was always right before Kings and always right after Joshua judges Ruth, kind of thing. Whereas that's not necessarily the case. A lot of times the books, some of the New Testament texts, especially Paul's letters, were just that. Paul sat down, wrote a letter, sent it off. Whereas especially some of the narrative texts were researched and people were collecting documents, and they might have been a collection of, like if you've ever seen somebody who's working on a book and you see they've got the various chapters. There's chapter 1 is over here, chapter 2 is over here, chapter 3 is over here, and these books were probably like that as well. That they would start and somebody would put in a section. Whereas, like if you look at Genesis is a series of accounts. The account of this, the account of that, the account of this, that were, I believe, at one point separate, and somebody came in and put them all together. And it's pretty clear if you read Genesis and the whole Pentateuch that somebody after Moses came in and organized it, edited it, so to speak, put it in the shape that we see it now. Moses wrote it, so I'm not arguing that point, but there are things that are said in the text that are clearly something, something talking about having a king there when there was no king in the day, but when they were editing it and putting it together, a king existed. Okay, and so when you look at this passage from 21 to 24, the last 3 chapters of the book of Samuel here, they, besides the fact that their linear point is a little fuzzy, it does seem to be its own section. It does seem to have its own coherent structure to it. It has what's called a chiasma, or it's sometimes pronounced chiasma, chiasma structure to it. And in a lot of Hebrew writing, that was a very common way to do that there was a structure to the writing. And a chiasma structure is where you have different subjects that are parallel based off of each other. So you would have, say, 6 sections, and the first section and the last section would somehow be related to each other, and the second section and the fifth section would be somehow related to each other, and the third and fourth sections would be somehow related to each other. Okay, so for example, in this one, we have a story of David on the first section, and the last section is a story of something David did. Then the second section has to do with a battle, and then the fourth section is a battle, and then the third and fourth section are 2 different poems. And so people look at this and say this is an individual unit kind of thing. And that's why I'm calling this epilogue. And I think that somebody had this first 21 chapters of the book of David, or 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, and somebody afterwards said, well, wait, we have to add these stories in. Sort of like an epilogue, if you've ever read a book, especially a nonfiction book, a history book, where, an epilogue, like, where are they today? What happened to them today? Or what happened to the person after the story ended, sort of thing. Something along that line. Some have looked at this section and said, you know what, this whoever put this in there, because there's a slightly different view of David here. If you look at just these 3 chapters, you get a slightly different view of David than you did in the 1 Samuel, all of it, all the way through, okay? And we'll talk about that a little bit today. So there are some who said that this is just linear, Okay, for example, Kylan Delitzsch. I think Kylan Delitzsch, I believe I'm pronouncing it correctly. Kylan Delitzsch is a commentary set that was first published in the mid 19th century, 1863 or something like that. And it was kind of the standard. I mean, it was, again, there were, when I was in college, you would go into you would go into the preacher boys' dorm rooms, and the really spiritual ones would have all these series of books around. Okay, and one of them was that everybody had Matthew Henry's commentary. You had to have Matthew Henry's commentary. Everybody would have, or not everybody, but the real fortunate ones would have the pulpit commentary. That was kind of a standard. And Kylan Delitzsch was another one of these that was really good to have. It helped that these were all in the public domain and people could publish them and they were fairly cheap to get. That had a lot to do with it. Spurgeon's Metropolitan Pulpit was another one that was fairly common. And so when I first, started collecting books, which I was like 5 at the time, but no. After I got married, I came into possession of a lot of these same books. At one point I had the pulpit commentary, and at one point I had Matthew Henry's, and I was very proud of myself. I suppose that's not really a good feeling to, my books. I have spiritual books. So I'm not going to be proud of myself. How's that for my humility? I don't know. But then after a while, and I was reading them, I started thinking to myself, I'm not reading these books. I'm not using these books. I'm not. So I gave them to somebody who could use them. So they're in good hands. But be that as it may, so somebody put this together. So we're going to think about that as we go through this last three chapters of the book of Samuel. So previously, I forgot the word previously there. If you remember the story in Joshua chapter 9, okay, we start in Joshua chapter 9 with the story of the Gibeonites. Okay, and I'm just going to tell you the story or remind you of the story that Joshua and the children of Israel are on a tear through Israel, the land of Palestine, this area that God had promised to them. They are just knocking down, cities and taking over places left and right. And there's a people group there called the Gibeonites. And they realize real quick that they're not going to be able to defeat the Israelites. And so what they do is they figure they're going to make trick the Israelites into a treaty, and that's exactly what they do. They dress up in old clothes, like old worn out clothes, and they just happen to have some moldy food lying around, and they come walking over the hill like I've been walking so, and they meet with Joshua and the children of Israel. And they say, oh, we've come from a far away. You can tell we've been so far away because look at how moldy our food is. And they do. The people of Israel do. They look at the food and they say, oh yeah, that's pretty moldy old food, kind of thing. You must have come from a long way away. And one of the things that you talk about, if you hear that preached, is there's no inquiring of the Lord goes on, and that's usually the lesson that is brought when you hear that event preached. But the end result was Joshua and Caleb and all of those guys in Joshua chapter 9 said, all right, sure, we're going to make we'll make a treaty with you. We won't harm you. You won't harm us, and everything will be great. 3 days later, they discover, hey, those guys that said they were from far away? Actually, they're on the other block. They're just right around the corner. And Joshua are furious with themselves, but they've made an agreement. They said, we're not going to hurt you. So they go in, and I believe the end of the story is they were destined to chop wood for the Israelites, for that became their duty. They became servants, but they survived. They lived. Okay. So our first line there in your text, it says, although it was based on deceit, the people of Israel in Joshua's time agreed to a treaty with the Gibeonites. Okay, so this is just one of those treaties that's floating around out there. Yes. Oh, yes. Okay. And then I said 2 Samuel 21-24 have a chiasmic structure, and that's usually where you see A, B, C, C prime, B prime, A prime. That's usually how it's structured or how it's pointed out. And are often seen as a separate additional unit to the story of David. However, historically, some have seen these chapters as being linear. for example, Kyle and Delich. Okay, I tend to believe, that's YTB, your teacher believes, the former is more likely the case. They were added. I don't think these were additional. And it's interesting if you think about it that way. Okay, it's one way to look at this and say, okay, these are stories that took place after the whole revolt of Sheba and Absalom and all of that kind of stuff. But we're long into the life and career of David. And so this is something that has been going on for quite some time. But let's see, where am I? How historically, but when you look at it and say, wait a minute, what if this took place before this event? Because it could have. Because sometimes there's things in here you think, well, wait a minute, if this took place here, that might have an effect on things. We'll get to that. We'll see why. So, so basically you hear in verse 21, during the reign of David, chapter 21, verse 1, during the reign of David, there was a famine for 3 successive years, so David sought the face of the Lord. Okay, now notice the timing, okay? There's no time marker. During the reign, okay? So it could have been day 2, let's see, it would have had to have been like day 3 and one day, or it could have been near the very end of the career. It's just during the reign. We don't have a specific time. During the reign of David, there's 3-year-long drought. Now that's unusual. Okay, a 1-year drought is bad. 2-year drought is really bad. 3-year drought, something's wrong here. Okay, and so David inquires of the Lord. Says, "Okay, Lord, what happened? Why is this happening like this?" Okay, and the Lord said, "It is on account of Saul and his blood-stained house. It is because he put the Gibeonites to death." Now the problem here is David was king for about 40 years. I mean, 40 years over Judah, 33 years over all the United Kingdom kind of thing. And if you take this as taking place at the end of David's career as king, it just is sort of weird to think that 40 years into his kingdom, the Lord says, you know what, I forgot to take care of that whole Gibeonite thing. Let's do that now. Okay, now that might have been how it happened. I doubt the Lord had that exact conversation, but it could have, okay? But he says, it is on account of Saul and his bloodstained house. It is because he put the Gibeonites to death. Okay, so a supernatural event had occurred, a 3-year drought, and David wants to know what the cause is, so he inquires of the Lord. That is, he sought the face of the Lord. Now that expression, sought the face of the Lord, this is the only time that's used related to David, but essentially it's the same idea, that he's inquiring of the Lord, either through one of his priests or however he's kind of getting an answer. Okay, David is told, see where it says David it told, that should be an S. David is told that it is because Saul put the Gibeonites to death. Now the thing is, there's no biblical record of this. Okay, there's no story in the Old Testament, in the book of Samuel, where Saul is out there killing Gibeonites. That doesn't mean, there's a lot of things that Saul did that are not in the Old Testament, okay? Again, the guy was king for 40 years, and we've got, a dozen chapters to talk about what he did. So clearly there's a lot of stuff, but it's just, there is no record of this happening, okay? So the king summoned the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now, the Gibeonites were not a part of Israel, but were survivors of the Amorites. The Israelites had sworn to spare them, but Saul, in his zeal for Israel and Judah, had tried to annihilate them. Okay, so at some point in the past, before David was king, Saul's army did something where they tried to get rid of the Gibeonites. Okay, in contradicting against this treaty that had been made in Joshua chapter 9. Okay, so he says, so David asked the Gibeonites. So David says, okay, we the nation of Israel have offended, have somehow the crossed the Gibeonites. What do I need to do to make this right? So he goes, what can I do for you? Okay, what shall I do for you? How shall I make atonement so that you will bless the Lord's inheritance? The Gibeonites answered him, we have no right to demand silver or gold from Saul or his family, nor do we have the right to put anyone in Israel to death. Okay, and I think their point here is that there's nothing we can do. Okay, there's nothing we can do. You're the the point is there's something you have to do. So David says, "What do you want me to do for you?" David asked. They answered the king, "As for the man who destroyed us and plotted against us so that we have been decimated and have no place anywhere in Israel, let 7 of his male descendants be given to us to be killed, and their bodies exposed before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the Lord's chosen one." An oddly specific request. That we know exactly what needs to be done. Okay, this is what you need to do. Now some have and so let me finish this. So the king said, "I will give them to you." Okay, the king said, "I will give them to you. I will do that." Now there are some again. Now this is we're looking at a slightly different look at David here. Okay, David had made a point, where to Jonathan that he would not harm his Jonathan's family. And it seemed that he wasn't going after Saul's family, which would have been the normal thing for any king to do. You kind of get rid of the remnants of the previous guy, so nobody is sitting around thinking, "Man, you remember the good old days when Saul was president?" President, king. What was Saul? He was the king, right? Okay. I had to get my hints from him. He was the king. Okay. Debbie's here explaining to me. So just, if there's any question, just look at Debbie. If she's nodding this way, I'm right. If she's nodding this way, just humor me. So the king said, "I will," and he just agrees. But wait a minute, I'm just gonna kill 7 of Saul's descendants. Okay, yeah, you got to kill 7 of Saul's descendants. Now some have looked at this and said this is that David did this, that this is a created story. And what I mean by that is David, in attempting to what's what I'm looking for? In attempting to wipe out anyone who might be a threat to his kingdom, killed these 7 people. And somebody created this story to kind of backfill. Oh, no, this is what happened. Okay. And it may have looked that way, because I don't know that there was a large, sometimes people do things for a very good reason. Debbie asks me to do something and I do something because Debbie asked me to do it. And, Marty sees me doing it and he's like, "What on earth are you doing?" And I'm like, it looks bad, but Debbie wants me to do this. Believe me. Okay. Especially if it's borderline illegal. That's my role in the Gardner wife empire. I just, I do the borderline illegal stuff. And say, no, it's okay. So they would not have, maybe somebody saw it and they were looking at it, and so there's a rumor out there. So another way to look at it is to say, David caused this event to happen, allowed this event to happen, and people knew about it. And he said, "Wait a minute, we need to get the story out why that happened." Okay. So in other words, they say, "Oh yeah, you remember David? Yeah, he's the guy that killed 7 of Saul's descendants." And that's all anybody remembers. And so David says, "Listen, we need to get this story out so people understand why these 7 descendants were killed." Okay. It's because Saul violated something, and then again, there's a whole thing of generational responsibility and stuff like that. But David was told it was because Saul put the Gibeonites to death. There's no biblical record. David asks, "What should I do for you?" Although the Gibeonites at first demur. "Oh no, we can't do anything." DEMUR, demur. I like that word, demur. Now I've lost it. In the end, they're pretty clear, which is I kind of like. I don't know. I just find that strange, weird. Like, yeah, we don't really know what we can do. I don't know. I've got no idea. Kill 7 of his descendants and expose them. Okay. I mean, maybe if you're in a relationship with somebody and you're asking, "What do you want to do?" "Oh, I don't know. What do you do?" When you finally push it, "What do you want to do? What do you want to do?" And suddenly they give you something very, very specific that they want to do, and like, "Whoa, you've known this all along. You're just kind of, so, again, we have these conversations and the next thing you know, I've got a shovel and a bag and I'm driving off somewhere in the car, sort of stuff. I was thinking we'd go to a baseball game or something. She was thinking, "Yeah, that would be fun. Yeah, but what I'd really like you to do is go shovel manure." "Okay, dear, I'd love to." So kind of things, very specific about what she wants me to do. And just for the record, I'm happy to do it. Just saying, I'm happy to do it. Although I took one of my sons with me once. I took each of my sons once to the whole menorah shoveling party, and never again because, oh man, talk about whining. It's like, has anybody actually like gone to a horse and shoveled? I don't know how I got off on this. I don't know. Okay, it's not that bad, right? You kind of think it's going to smell like an outhouse. It doesn't, right? You put it in a bag. It's fine. It's no big deal. But he's like, I can't believe I'm standing here. Okay, fine. I'll have to edit this part out of the thing. I'm sorry, then.
Just a quick question. Would it be appropriate? Did this story emerge to cover something that was done that shouldn't have been done, or is this the accurate description of what happened to the seven? Yep. When you were saying,
That is a possibility. The first thing. So the question is, was this story created to cover something that shouldn't have been done? That is a possibility. Okay, but I don't believe so. Okay, again, so I believe in the inspiration and the inerrancy and the correction of the text, that this was written to explain why that took place.
Something else was being bantered about.
Right.
What happened? That it was
right.
political. But no, okay.
Right. So that's what I think. What I think this is. Yeah. Yes. So so the king said, "I will give them to you." The king spared Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the oath before the Lord between David and Jonathan, son of Saul. But the king took Armani and Mephibosheth, the two sons of Aiah's daughter Rizpah, whom she had. So I could do the whole family tree here. Just trust me, they're all descendants of Saul. Okay, they're either they're all grandsons of Saul. But the king took Armani and Mephibosheth, the two sons of Aiah's daughter Rizpah. Okay, so this is not the same Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth is the son of Jonathan. There's Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, and then there's Mephibosheth, the son of Rizpah. Mephibosheth is a great name. If we'd had a third son, we would have named him Mephibosheth. But the two sons of Aiah, Saul, together with the five sons of Saul's daughter Merab, whom she had borne to Adriel, son of Barzillah, the Mahalathite. Now, the interesting thing about this particular line in the text is that some of the texts, rather than Merab, have the name Michael. That is, these are the sons of Michael. Okay, Michael as in Saul's daughter, David's first wife. Okay. Now, again, in order for that to be the same Michael, now there could have been two Michaels, okay, or it could be this person Merab. It could be somebody with a couple of different names, and we're going to get into this whole different name thing here before the end, anyway, as well. But if that's the case, then that means, because there's no indication that when Michael was married to Lachish, if you remember Lachish, he was the one following her back, that there's that there were any children involved. Okay, but I mean, there could have been another marriage in the middle there somewhere after David left. There could have been another marriage. I don't know. But most, especially like with the NIV, I don't know. Does anybody have a translation that gives Michael? You probably have it in a note at the bottom. Does it? Yeah. The NIV gives.
Tells which texts use which.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. There are. The NIV has a text note at the bottom. 2 Hebrew manuscripts, some Septuagint manuscripts in Syriac. Most Hebrew and Septuagint manuscripts use Michael.
Yeah, with my online version, there's two versions next to each other.
Mm-hmm.
So New Living Translation is Merib, and the New King James is Michael.
Michael, okay. So again, could be the same Michael. Again, we don't know what Michael was doing when she's not in the text. So there could have been, yes.
It's kind of unrelated, but in the footnote that you just read, like, what is Septuagint?
The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So the Septuagint was in terms of looking at the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, we have essentially 4 main sources. I mean, there are a lot of little manuscripts and stuff around, but there's let's see if I got this right. There's there's 2. There's the Septuagint, there's the Masoretic text, there's the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I forget what the other one is now. Yeah, the Vulgate is a translation of the Septuagint, kind of thing. But well, at least three. Okay, so usually it's the Masoretic text and the Septuagint are the two main things. The thing is, the Septuagint is that's where they had 70. This is the legend. 70 people, 70 scholars got all of the Old Testament Bible together, texts together, and translated it. And we have a Greek translation. And because of the number 70, the shorthand for the Septuagint is LXX, which is Roman 470. So when we say the LXX says this, that's the Septuagint. The thing is, the Septuagint was translated in 200 BC. Okay, so that's the earliest full collection of the Hebrew Bible that we have. Okay, so the earliest, although it was clearly written in Hebrew, okay, and some Aramaic, but it or not, well, whatever, Hebrew. Okay, whereas the Masoretic text, which was like the first, physical copy that we have of the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew, is from like the 9th century AD. Yeah. So it's kind of, so it's like, it's really weird that, sometimes you go and you say, wow, okay, well, you have to go to the Hebrew text. Well, the Hebrew text comes like 900 years after the Greek translation of it. And so there's some, it's interesting, but it's simpler in the Old Testament than it is in the New Testament. Because in the New Testament, for any one of the books of the New Testament, there's like a 50, 60, 70 different documents around it, copies and this, that, and the other. But that's what the Septuagint is. The Syriac, maybe the Syriac was the other one. The Syriac is the what was translated in is called the Peshitta, and that is like the woman at the well. The woman at the well, where we worship on the mountain. That would be the Syriac Christian, and they claim to have the oldest complete translation of the Bible. So, the Peshitta is the Syriac version. And this is going to be on your test, so you all should be writing this down. Okay. Yeah. So you don't see it too often. Usually, you just see it available. It's like the Syriac Bible, or the Lamsa translation is another one. That's the Syriac translation. But this is, again, depending on when it was written. Sometimes things changed. Okay. So over the course of 900 years. So the king spares Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, etc. He handed them over to the Gibeonites, who killed them and exposed their bodies on a hill before the Lord. Now, this has nothing to do with anything, but I'm feeling like I'm about to sneeze. So if there's a long, awkward pause, just saying. He handed them over to the Gibeonites, who killed them and exposed their bodies on a hill before the Lord. Okay, so basically what's going on here is, to not be buried was a tremendous dishonor. Okay, when you talk about, being buried with your fathers, and that was something that everybody wanted, to not be buried was to be eaten by animals, so to speak, was a tremendous dishonor to the family. There's a whole, there's there's a Greek tragedy, Euripides, or I don't know, can't remember which one it is. If you've ever seen a Greek tragedy, these are those things where somebody wrongs the woman and the woman kills everybody. And this is Debbie's idea of a rom-com, but it's just, I'm kidding. If she ever thinks I'm going to get out of line, she says, let's watch another one of those Greek tragedies again, just to kind of, but so it would be a great dishonor. And so the point was, not only are we going to kill these 7, we are going to dishonor them by not burying them. We just lay their body out on a rock and wait for the birds and the animals to eat them up. Okay, we're going to make our point. So everybody's going to know, and the advantage, I guess, is that everybody sees this. It's a very visible thing. Everybody can see, hey, look, we're the Gibeonites. We got ours in the end, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. He handed them over to the Gibeonites, who killed them and exposed their bodies on the hill before the Lord. All 7 of them fell together. They were put to death during the first days of the harvest, just as the barley harvest was beginning. Now Rizpah, daughter of Ai, now she's sister with 2 of them, cousins of the other 5, took sackcloth and spread it out for herself on a rock. From the beginning of the harvest till the rain poured down from the heavens on bodies. She did not let the birds touch them by day or the wild animals by night. Okay, so this woman says, okay, you're not going to honor them by giving them a burial, but I'm not going to let the animals dishonor them. And I'm going, again, this is another one of the women of Samuel. And I think, again, somebody's going to write this book and they're going to sell billions of copies. And I expect a shout out in the introduction kind of thing. But this is another one of the women of Samuel who kind of points out to David or sets David a little bit kind of a corrective. Sometimes it's more than others. Okay, so basically this woman gives up her life for this period of time, and it's several weeks. It's from the beginning of the harvest until the rains start. Okay, so it's not like overnight. It's like day after day after day after day. And of course, somebody's feeding her, they're bringing her food, and all she does, days and days and days and days, is keep the animals away from eating, or destroying these 7 bodies. Okay, not exactly my line of work that I want to get into, but this was important. This was something that somebody had to protect the body, and so she does it. When David was told what Aiah's daughter Rizpah, Saul's concubine, had done, we get a little information again, going back to the whole thing about concubines and wives and sons and all of that. He went and took the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan from the citizens of Jabesh Gilead. Now, if you remember that story, so Jabesh, Saul and Jonathan had been killed, and the people from Jabesh Gilead, the Philistines had hung their bodies up on a wall, and they came by night and they took the bodies back. Okay, and now David realizes, okay, Saul and Jonathan have not been buried either. Okay, I mean it's out of his control. He was at war, it's kind of thing, but he kind of knows in the back of his mind that's where they are. And so he realizes what this woman has done. And I think there's a point where he goes, okay, you know what? This is, it's like a protest that finally makes, said, okay, you know what? You've made your point. How do we get beyond this? How can David get out of this situation where he's, it's being forced? And it's just, why does everybody know that these 7 were killed? Because the bodies were exposed on these rocks for months and months. If they'd have been killed and buried, then maybe people would have forgot. But it's hard to forget when every time you're walking by this field, you look, hey, look at that. What's over there? Okay, 7 bodies and a woman running back and forth. Keeping, yeah. So so this is one of the reasons I think why David needed to say, okay, here's I'm in this because Saul had done something. Okay, so I was directed to do this kind of stuff. And so, but he went and took the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan from the citizens of Jabesh Gilead. They had stolen their bodies from the public square at Bethshan, where the Philistines had hung them after they struck Saul down on Gilboa. Gilboa. And we went over that story. It's just interesting here. And again, this is where, perhaps we're looking at a different writer, because the first time this story, it's not described as stealing the bodies, although, I mean, it's I suppose you could say they were stolen. I mean, it's not that the Philistines owned them, although, kind of, but it's just a different word use, which suggests a different writer describing the same event. So David brought the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan from there, and the bones of those who had been killed and exposed were gathered up. So David is like, okay, this is enough. This is enough. We need to, that's as much as you're going to get. We're done here, kind of thing. They buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan in the tomb of Saul's father and did everything the king commanded. After that, God answered prayer in behalf of the land. Okay, so again, David is saying, what you guys saw, what the popular world saw, the people saw was that these 7 people got killed in a very extravagant way. David is held responsible for it, and also the drought ended. And so David is, like, wow, well, we would complain more about David, but the drought ended. But we got to go plant. But perhaps David is thinking, no, you guys need to see these are all working together. Okay, God is working. This was one of one of the things that God commanded him to do. Let me see, where am I? The Gibeonites kill and expose the 7 descendants of Saul, Rizpah, another granddaughter of Saul, protects the bodies for months. David, hearing of Rizpah's efforts, gives all of them an honorable burial, including the remains of Saul and Jonathan. Okay. So again, this is like this additional story that's kind of tacked on. Hey, let's clear this little misconception up about David. Okay. He did not go on a murderous rampage to get rid of all of the descendants of Saul. Okay. It was Saul's fault because of his attack on the Gibeonites.
And is this also like the formal ending of the Saul story, the Saul family story?
It is. Yeah, I mean, Mephibosheth lives, but I don't think there's no record. Did he have children? Can't remember if he did or not. I don't think he did. But it does explain what happened to a large number of Saul's family. Meanwhile, any other questions on that? You'll never look at 7 rocks again. Same thing. So you go by and you'll see 7 rocks laying out there. Kind of. I mean, it's an interesting story. This one doesn't usually get picked up in the children's church. I don't know why. We like that whole David and Goliath thing, but the 7 bodies on that one, we just pass over that one. Verse 15, beginning of verse 15. So meanwhile, the Philistines are still a problem. Because again, this is going back into the middle of David's reign. Because by the end of David's reign, the Philistines were not a problem. Now, if you think they're linear, then you got to go, oh, well, the Philistines are back. Okay, well, so this is kind of go back in, and we start telling some stories about things that happened while fighting various Philistines. Once again, in verse 15, once again, there was a battle between the Philistines and Israel. David went down with his men to fight against the Philistines, and he became exhausted. Okay, so David is leading. Maybe he's getting a little bit older, can't keep up like he used to be. He used to be able to. Okay, when he was a young guy running, it was great. But when you get in your 30s, 40s, I don't know if you get much older than that. I wouldn't know. I mean, being only 39 myself, I don't know how that would, what that feels like. But David went down with his men to fight against the Philistines, and he became exhausted. And Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of Rapha, whose bronze spearhead weighed 300 shekels. Okay, so that's fairly heavy. That's about 7 pounds. Okay, and that's the spearhead. So he's got a spear, so he's a big guy, big, strong guy. Whose bronze spearhead weighed 300 shekels, and who was armed with a new sword, said he would kill David. And I'm guessing that this is it's in the heat of the battle, and I see you, because they can pick out who David is, maybe by what he's wearing or whatever, where he is, how he's surrounded. Because you think about it, if you're in a battle, even if the king is dressed like everyone else, one way to tell who the king is say, okay, look where there's a scrum of people around, and who's in the center. That's probably the king. Okay, but regardless, he knows. He says, but Abishai, son of Zeruiah, came to David's rescue. He struck the Philistine down and killed him. Again, remember Abishai? We know Abishai. This is Joab's brother. Okay, he's the one. Joab and Abishai were part and parcel of killing Abner, and Abishai was the one that wanted to kill Saul. So it's the Abishai and Joab. Well, they both have a very murderous side to them. Okay, I mean, there's no question about it. But here's this example where Abishai saves David's life. And the reason David is in this situation is because he's exhausted. He just can't fight anymore. Somebody has to come in and rescue him. Then David's men swore to him, saying, never again will you go out with us to battle, so that the lamp of Israel will not be extinguished. Okay, so here his men say, listen, you can't keep up with us anymore. You need to stay back at the castle or back at the palace. Okay, now, again, if you see this as being linear, you say, okay, well, he's in his 70s and he can't go on. I'm just making up an age. Okay, but if you look at this as another story explaining something else, what do you suppose this could explain? Bathsheba. Why is David at home in 2 Samuel 11? Okay, again, we like to, again, it's a hot topic in preaching that story to say David is somehow wrong for being home. He should have been out the king. But if this story, which could have took place beforehand, He's not there because he wants to. He's there because he can't keep up with the guys, and so he goes and he's home. Okay, so maybe somebody is looking at it and saying, okay, you know what? David looks bad in that story. We need to at least give him a reason why he's there. Okay, plus it shows off Abishai's murderous side. Okay, but so never again will you go with me, and that's it. That's all this story is. It just gives us this example where David, you need to stay back in the palace. Okay, then there's no time marker. But again, it's just kind of given a little bit more information that fits in with the previous story. In the course of time, all right, let me get this here. David fighting with his men becomes exhausted. A Philistine comes close to killing David, but the Philistine is killed by Abishai. David's men swear to him that David will never go with them to battle. In the course of time, there was another battle with the Philistines at Gob. At the time, Sibbecai, the Hushathite, killed Saph, one of the descendants of Rapha. Okay, this same guy, again, big leader. In another battle, now this is something that the people that are reading this would have recognized who these people are. Okay, so the original readers would have known. Now we've lost that. Okay, in another battle with the Philistines, here we go, verse 19. Okay, verse 19 is one of the great controversial verses in the book of Samuel. Okay, it's one of the great controversial verses in the book of Samuel. Let's just read it. In another battle with the Philistines of God, Elhanan, son of Jair the Bethlehemite, killed the brother of Goliath the Gittite, who had a spear with a shaft like a weaver's rod. Okay, and if you have an NIV, you will notice that it says in 1 Chronicles 25, it kind of tracks with that version of the story. The Hebrew does not have the word the brother of. Okay, so the text in the Hebrew says Elhanan killed Goliath the Gittite, who was a big guy and had a big spear. Okay, well, wait a minute. I thought David killed Goliath. Well, here it says this guy killed Goliath. Okay, and so if you have a very low view of Scripture, so some would say this is one of the great contradictions of the book of Samuel. Samuel says two different people killed Goliath. Okay, there's a couple of different. So Second Samuel is one of the most controversial Old Testament texts. So who killed Goliath? Okay, who killed Goliath? Some have said that. So if you have a very, I'll call it a low view of inspiration of Scripture, you would say that, well, Elhanan killed Goliath, but the story was tracked back to make it look like David killed him, to kind of create the hero story. It's sort of the idea, back in the early part of the 19th century, there was a writer named Parson Weems who used to write these books, and he used to write these books about Washington and just make up stories, cherry trees chopping down and that kind of stuff, that just make up stuff that made Washington look to be a much more virtuous person than he actually was. I'm not saying Washington's a bad guy at all, but he would just create these stories. Okay, and people read them, and here, just go. Kids in third grade, here, read this story. This is going to tell you about, and it wasn't true, right? It just said, oh, well, Washington's such a great guy. And so some have looked at that and said, well, somebody said, you know what? This story would really track well if we put David as a youngster out there, and everybody will go, wow, David, what a great guy. And they did. But then later on, somebody in making these corrections says, wait a minute, Elhanan. So that and there are some that will do that. But David doesn't really kill Goliath. Elhanan kills Goliath. And that's just an emendation, a correction, a gloss, a correction, or just a fabrication. Okay? Again, I don't believe that. I'm just telling you this is, if you're reading a commentary, they're going to say, depending on who wrote it, you're going to get that kind of a statement. So, verse 22, so who killed Goliath? There's some possible suggestions. 22:19 is correct. 1 Samuel 17 is conflated. That they put the story of Elhanan and the story of David and kind of conflated, put the two to, when you conflate two things, you take two events and suddenly they become one. Okay, so sometimes, if your kids are telling you a story from their childhood, and suddenly it's like, oh, do you remember that time we went to a baseball game and we met a football player? And you say, well, no, we went to a baseball game and we went to a football game. And you met the football player at the football game, but when the kid is telling you the story 2 or 3 years later, I went to a baseball game and met a football player. The stories are conflated. Okay, and we do that a lot. People do that a lot as they tell their stories. Okay, this is one of the reasons why, 2 or more witnesses kind of thing, because you never know what one person's story is going to be.
Sam, can we talk about this a little bit more?
Sure.
What did the oldest version of the scripture in Hebrew say? Was it this version or was it the brother?
I don't know. I would.
What do you think? Do you think this is a
Well, I'm.
conflated?
I got to get down to the bottom of this sheet here.
The
I'm a
New
drama
Living, the New Living Translation here said that Elhanan from Bethlehem killed the brother of Goliath.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But in this one, it's not. And so there's a question of why is he said I killed Goliath here and the brother of there? So, because that's 2 different people. So there's this issue as far as which is it. So one idea is that it's correct, and Elhanan is the one who killed it, and the story of David is just a makeup. That's one of the possibilities. Okay. Second possibility is that it's a copyist error. That somebody in writing, again, they didn't have the fact checking that the world used to have before the internet came along. Okay, so we had really good fact checking up until about 2001. When did Google become our go-to thing? But it was just a copyist error that they were just telling the story and it's killed this. That's a possibility as well. Okay, another possibility is that what is called a seeming contradiction. Okay, that there are ways of looking at this and saying, okay, wait a minute, it's the text is correct in 1 Samuel 17 or 16. David killed him. It could be that Elhanan is an alternative name for David. I don't, it's a variation of God, but I don't know what the word means now that I think about it. That Elhanan is a name, an alternative name for David. It could be that the name Goliath is a title and not a personal name. So rather than saying, he's king, okay, that's not a name, that's a title. You could say he's king, well, he's Goliath. Okay, so it could be that the giant of the army, that was a position, and that position name was Goliath. Okay, it's sort of like the Hebrew word Satan or Satan. That's a position, it's not a personal name. There is somebody who is the Satan. Remember, we talked about this with Abishai. Who made you Satan? Who made you the accuser? Okay, and we just use that so much, that title so much, that we say, oh, that's a name. Well, it's actually a title. Okay, Messiah, Christ, that's a title. Okay, say, but that's one idea. And I like that idea. I like the idea that Goliath is a title. It's just it's a position. The leader, the biggest fighter, that's their Goliath. And then, of course, similar to that, the final idea is there were more than one person named Goliath, which is also possible. Okay, so there's and again, the book of Samuel was not written with the level of detail of historical accuracy that we would look at today in a historical book. I mean, it was great for the time, and I believe it's accurate. Okay, but it's not, they didn't have the fact checkers going through. In still another battle which took place at Gath, there was a huge man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. He also was descended from Rapha. This Rapha guy gets around, I'm just saying. When he taunted Israel, Jonathan, son of Shemaiah, David's brother, killed him. So again, another one of David's relatives. These 4 were descendants of Rapha and Gath, and they fell at the hands of David and his men. Okay, so it's kind of just talking about the story of David and his men, some of the some of the battles there. Next week, we will talk about David's. We have 2 poems we'll talk about. Okay, and one of the reasons why we think David was the psalmist and could write music and poetry was because of what we see here in chapter 22. Chapter 22 and David's final words at the beginning of chapter 23. I think we'll get through it all next week. Hope to. That's the plan. We'll continue with that. Any questions? So I like the idea that Goliath is a title. So that David kills Goliath. He kills the Goliath in 1 Samuel 16. 1 Samuel 16 or 17. I can never remember which one it is. And that Elhanan killed the Goliath of that group, kind of thing. Okay, I like that idea. I like that suggestion because then it's easier than just saying, "Oh, there's a contradiction." We'll have to stress on it.
And in that theory, the insertion of brother would be that copy error.
Yes. Any questions? Any other questions? All right. Thank you very much. See you guys all here next week.